Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. France has become the first G7 nation to recognize Palestine, triggering praise from Arab nations and backlash from Israel and the United States. Ceasefire talks are still continuing as Gaza's death toll exceeds 60,000 and starvation worsens for the 2 million people in the war-torn enclave.
French President Emmanuel Macron announced on Thursday that France will formally recognize the State of Palestine in September during the United Nations General Assembly. It marks a landmark decision that places France at the forefront of Western efforts to revive the two-state solution. In a letter addressed to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and shared publicly on social media platform X, Macron confirmed the move, describing it as part of France's long-standing commitment to peace in the Middle East. France, home to Europe's largest Jewish and Muslim populations, will become the first major Western power and the first G7 country to formally recognize Palestinian statehood, an act that could shift the diplomatic landscape and encourage other nations to follow suit. The announcement sparked immediate and strong criticism from both Israel and the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denounced France's plan as a reward for terror, warning that recognizing a Palestinian state under current conditions would create a security threat for Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also strongly rejected France's decision, saying it undermines peace efforts and emboldens extremist groups. The United States has already warned against unilateral recognition of Palestine, cautioning that it could contradict American foreign policy interests and lead to consequences. Macron's decision follows months of internal discussions and diplomatic pressure. Despite the backlash, the French president appears determined to proceed, framing the recognition as a crucial step to keeping the two-state vision alive in an increasingly volatile region.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa Kocakinar, Anews editor, welcome to the program as well.
Good morning, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start with the French decision. French President Emmanuel Macron has said that France will recognize the State of Palestine at the upcoming UN General Assembly. Tell me more about these latest developments, Mustafa.
Omar, yesterday, I think France took an important steps in terms of bringing long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility to the Middle East. French President Emmanuel Macron announced his government's decision to recognize Palestine as an independent state, and he said that France will officially recognize Palestine at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. And it is clearly showing that France is considering the legitimate rights of Palestinian people living in the region. But on the other hand, we know that Macron's decision sparked US and Israel backlash. American and Israeli decision makers immediately slammed Macron's decision to recognize Palestine as an independent state. We know that the United States is opposing a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under the Trump administration, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday warned France against unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state. On the other hand, Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also slammed Macron's decision over the independence of the Palestinian state. On the other hand, other Israeli decision makers within the war cabinet also harshly criticized France's diplomatic steps and initiatives in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility in the Middle East. We know that since the very beginning of the geopolitical tensions in the region, Turkey has been calling for regional solutions for regional problems, and Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the Middle East. Turkey has been always calling for two-state solution to the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know that Turkey is pursuing the goal of establishing and recognizing a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We know that some Western countries, including Spain and Norway, have already recognized the Palestinian statehood and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I think that France's decision to recognize Palestine will pave the way for the establishment of a Palestinian state. I think that many Western countries will follow France's decision, because France is set to become first G7 country in terms of recognizing Palestine as a statehood. I think that Macron's latest decision will yield positive results in terms of solving a decades-old dispute between Palestinians and Israelis.
Mustafa, you've said some Israeli cabinet members have also criticized the French decision, and then we saw a statement on X, formerly Twitter, by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He also condemned the decision, saying that it's only going to support the Hamas movement. So what do you make of these statements, when the Secretary of State of the United States is saying that these efforts are going to support Hamas, when we know that over 60,000 people have been killed in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Omar, we know that lunatics on the right and left side of politics in the United States are controlling the Trump administration. We know that even some American senators are claiming that those who support Israel will be blessed by the God, and those who against Israel will be cursed by the God. And it is clearly showing that Israeli lobby is controlling the Trump administration right now. We also know that Zionist figures have been influenced over the Trump administration. U.S. President Donald Trump has been always reaffirming United States' unwavering support for Israel's so-called national security demands in the region. We know that since January, Trump hosted Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu several times to the White House, and they discuss all aspects of bilateral ties between Tel Aviv and Washington, and exchange views on the regional security developments in the region. Trump is also pursuing the relocation of Gazan people from the Gaza Strip. But on the ground, we know that United States peace plans, so-called peace plans, will not yield positive results in terms of ensuring stability and political security in the Middle East, because we know that right now Israel has been controlling the United States. Within this context, we cannot count on the United States' role in terms of upholding peace and tranquility in the region. On the other hand, as you mentioned, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday condemned Macron's decision to recognize Palestine as a state. It is clearly showing that the international community cannot count on the United States' diplomatic role in terms of solving Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that under the Trump administration, the United States will continue to turn the blind eye to atrocities committed by the Israeli security forces in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Musa, how would you compare the ceasefire efforts and the support, the American support and the European support for Ukrainians as compared to the Palestinians? Because we've been seeing that ceasefire efforts are ongoing. Just recently, the Israeli team has withdrawn its its delegation from Doha. It returned back to Tel Aviv. How are you looking at these efforts? Do you think that the European and American support is much more stronger for Ukraine than it is for the Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Omar, I think that it will be better to compare the ceasefire efforts for Ukraine and Gaza to understand Western hypocrisy deeply. We know that during his presidential campaign last year, Donald Trump promised to end ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia and Israel's military actions within Gaza within 24 hours. And he started his second term as president at the White House in January. And right now we are in July. We are set to enter August. And it is clearly showing that Trump failed to promise his foreign policy goals during his presidential campaign. On the other hand, we know that United States military support for Israel is making the country be able to continue its military offensive in the region. On the other hand, since the very beginning of his second second term, Trump has been calling for cessation of ongoing conflicts between Ukraine and Russia in Eastern Europe. We know that within this context, Turkey has Istanbul hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. At the end of May, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio represented his country during the negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. And we know that this week, Istanbul also hosted another round of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And right now, the international and regional stakeholders are trying to facilitate and mediate talks between two sides in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility in the Eastern Europe. We know that last week Trump took concrete steps in terms of bringing Russia to the negotiating table to strike a ceasefire deal. It is clearly showing that Western countries are determined to halt ongoing conflicts between Ukraine and Russia. But on the other hand, when the topic comes to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Western countries are still trying to increase their strong support for Israel in terms of making Israel be able to continue its military offensive. We know that some Western countries, including France, Germany, and United Kingdom, are increasing their pressures on Israel to halt military actions in the region, but on the ground they are still sending ammunition and weapons to Israel. On the other hand, we know that American decision makers are always reiterating United States support for Israel's so-called national security demands. And it is clearly showing the Western hypocrisy when the topic comes to Palestinian issue. They are still turning a blind eye to Israeli activities in the region. I think the Western countries made a mistake at the very beginning of the crisis. The bottom line is that the international community, Western countries in particular, shouldn't have turned a blind eye to Israeli atrocities in the occupied territories.
Mustafa, exactly. You can take a look at, what's happening in the United Kingdom as well. Keir Starmer has said that, whatever's going on in the occupied Gaza Strip is intolerable. He hasn't used the word genocide, but he says he has said that the Israeli actions are horrible, they're intolerable, but still. And what's more important is that the Labour manifesto back in 2024 was that Keir Starmer said that he will recognize Palestine as an independent state. But now that's not happening. He hasn't used the word genocide as well. They're refraining from using such terminology. But, that's what I'm saying. That's the double standard that we've been seeing. And again, the UK has been sponsoring flights over Gaza, spy flights. So at the end of the day, there is a lot of the double standard is there. We have to say that. The double standard is there, and, they have to change their ideas. They have to change their ideologies in order to support the Palestinians. But so apart from that, there's another development from Israel. The Israeli parliament has overwhelmingly voted to annex the occupied West Bank. What are the developments there, Mustafa? Even though this move is symbolic, but what impact could it have?
Well, we know that Israeli security forces captured and occupied West Bank decades ago, and since then Israeli military forces have been increasing their military activities against Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. On the other hand, we know that right now within Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, some far-right figures are pursuing the full annexation of West Bank by Israel. On the other hand, we know that international community is strongly against Israel's military activities in the West Bank. The international criticism is mounting on Israel over the deteriorating humanitarian situation both in Gaza and West Bank. We know that some far-right figures within the cabinet are pushing Netanyahu to annex West Bank totally, and it is clearly showing that Israeli security forces have not only taken aim at Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, they are also targeting other Palestinians living in the West Bank, and it is clearly showing Israel's biggest geopolitical agenda in the region. We are always claiming that Israeli decision makers are striving to make Israel the only hegemon in the Middle East, and they are pursuing expansionist geopolitical agenda in the region. And yesterday, Israeli parliament government took steps in terms of annexing the West Bank, and Turkey's foreign ministry issued a written statement condemning Israel's latest steps about the West Bank, and Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about Israel's geopolitical agenda, because Turkey thinks that if there is something wrong in the Middle East, it will spread the cause to the other parts of the world, and this situation pursued by the Israeli security forces will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. Turkey has been always warning against Israel's provocations in the Middle East, and I think that with the diplomatic efforts pursued by Turkey, the international community will increase its diplomatic pressure on Israel, and diplomatic isolation of Israel, I think that will yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-standing and sustainable peace, tranquility, and stability in the region.
Mustafa, Saudi Arabia has commended this decision from France, right? And now Saudi Arabia says that if it will be a part of the Abraham Accords, then the world should recognize Palestine as a state. And Saudi Arabia has also been backing the two-state solution. Now, earlier this year, we heard reports that Saudi Arabia and France are going to hold a conference at the UN, which was delayed, and now that has been rescheduled for September. So, Mustafa, when we talk about the Abraham Accords, what do you think about it? What's your analysis about the Abraham Accords? Because the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco are still a part of the Abraham Accords. And recently, when Iran fired missiles into Israel, the UAE sent humanitarian aid to the Israelis. So how are you looking at the Abraham Accords, Mustafa? What can we expect from these? Do you think that other countries will join sooner than later?
Well, we know that during his first presidency, Trump initiated Abraham Accords in terms of normalizing bilateral relationships between Israel and Arab countries. Some Arab countries, as you mentioned, joined Abraham Accords, and they normalized their bilateral or multilateral relationships with Israel. On the other hand, we know that during his second presidency, Trump has been always calling for other Arab countries to join the Abraham Accords. We know that in May, U.S. President Donald Trump paid an official visit to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, and he met with Syrian leader Ahmed al-Shara on the sidelines of the Gulf Cooperation Council summit in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh. He is also calling upon Syria to join the Abraham Accords, but we know that on the ground, Israel is still taking aim at Syria's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. As you know, last week Israel strikes military infrastructure and in Syria, and it is clearly showing that Israel is pursuing expansionist geopolitical agenda in the region. I don't think that right now Saudi Arabia or other Arab countries will join the Abraham Accords, because we know that international criticism is mounting on Israel over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Within this situation, if these countries join Abraham Accords and normalize their bilateral ties with Israel, I think that their public opinion will criticize their decision makers in terms of normalizing bilateral ties with Israel. I think that the bottom line is that given the current geopolitical circumstances in the region, other Arab countries will not join Abraham Accords, and they will not normalize their bilateral ties with Israel. On the other hand, we know that the geopolitical tensions are rising in the Middle East in recent times. Turkey has been always calling for regional unity and solidarity in terms of addressing geopolitical challenges posed by the Israeli decision makers. I think that unity and solidarity will be needed by regional stakeholders if they want to deal with the security challenges in the Middle East.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you. War-weary families in war-torn Gaza are facing relentless displacement and deepening hunger as Israeli airstrikes and ground operations continue.
Pushing their disabled young family member in a wheelchair across southern Gaza, the Al-Barims have scrambled through the rubble of the Gaza Strip many times, fleeing Israeli bombardments and ground assaults. Majid al-Barim has lost count of the times they have moved to escape, sometimes taking hours to travel across the enclave.
We are slowly dying every day. Is there anyone on this planet who can live what a human is living in Gaza? I don't think anyone can bear what we are bearing. It has been 2 years of the war, hunger, killing, destruction and displacement. All of them are innocent people, unarmed civilians, and they are displacing us.
Having originally fled their own home in Khan Yunis, his family sought shelter in the homes of friends or relatives, in school classrooms, and then in tents, moving each time as Israel ordered civilians from one zone to another. Their tale illustrates the plight of the 1.9 million Gaza residents, 90% of the population that the United Nations says have been displaced during the conflict. Nizar Bakroun and his family have fled from multiple locations across Gaza in search of somewhere safe. But an airstrike on a building next to their tent in Gaza City killed 2 of his children and badly injured his wife Amal. His son Rebbe and daughter Olena were just 8 and 10 years old.
We returned to Gaza City, thank God, after the truce came, and we thought things would get better and that things were starting to calm down. We came here and tried to settle or start to establish ourselves in tents until we could figure out where things were heading to. We were surprised that things got even worse. My sister, her children and her husband were martyred. My children were martyred. My father was martyred. My children, my wife and my mother were injured. The famine returned.
Israel has issued evacuation orders in areas where it plans to carry out operations, though it has also struck elsewhere during these periods. Israel says evacuation orders protect civilians, but it strikes wherever it locates Hamas fighters. Palestinians accuse Israel of indiscriminate attacks and of uprooting the population. 2.1 million civilians are now squeezed into a fragmented 12% of the Strip, where essential services have collapsed, according to the United Nations. Hunger is also gripping the Palestinian enclave, with local authorities saying dozens have starved to death in the last few weeks.
Welcome back. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, we've been talking about Israel, but then we've also seen in the past few days some wildfires have been impacting Turkey. Let's discuss those first, Mustafa. That's the headline from Daily Sabah.
Well, first of all, I would like to wish Allah's mercy upon Turkish firefighters who lost their lives in the Turkey's Anatolian province, Eskişehir. I think that following the loss of the 10 firefighting personnel during the ongoing wildfire containment efforts, I think that Turkish authorities have launched comprehensive investigations to determine all contributing factors and ensure accountability while continuing nationwide operation to battle the blaze. As you know, we are in a summer season right now, and Turkey has been experiencing wildfires during summer seasons. I think that Turkish firefighters are relentlessly making efforts to battle the blaze. I think that the Turkish nation will be united against the wildfires, and right now many Turkish citizens are also helping Turkish firefighters in terms of battling blaze. Then I wish Allah's mercy upon all Turkish fighters who lost their lives during wildfires.
Mustafa, also on Daily Sabah is Israel and Hamas exploring a new truce plan. Now, we know the demands from both sides, but Hamas is now saying that the starvation must end in order to achieve any sort of ceasefire. What are the latest developments, Mustafa, from there?
Omar, as you mentioned, Israeli decision makers and Hamas officials were supposed to meet each other to discuss the possible terms for a ceasefire deal, and United States is also supposed to join the peace negotiations between Hamas and Israel. But according to latest developments, United States and Israel have withdrawn from these negotiations, citing Hamas expectations. It is clearly showing that the United States and Israel are not in side of dialogue and diplomacy to put an end to the conflicts in the region. I think that the United States will continue to support Israel's military activities in the region. And on the other hand, we know that people are being starved to death by Israel in the occupied Gaza Strip. US and Israel launched so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation at the end of May to distribute aid packages to the war-weary Palestinians living in the war-torn Gaza Strip, but they are also still targeting Palestinians waiting for the humanitarian aid packages. And right now, international pressure is mounting on Israel over a ceasefire deal. But I don't think that under the Trump administration, United States will facilitate or mediate talks between Israelis and Hamas to deal with the security challenges in the region.
Mustafa, also there's another headline that I want to focus on Daily Sabah. No sabotage trap will hinder the terror-free Turkey initiative. These were the statements made by Turkish President Erdogan. Mustafa, at what point are we in this initiative between the Turkish government and the PKK terror group, where the PKK has laid down its arms and is saying that it will disarm and will dissolve? Now, at which stage are we?
Umar, as you know, last year, Turkey's opposition Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli initiated proposed terror-free Turkey initiative, and since then, both the ruling AK Party and opposition parties have been taking steps to realize the government's terror-free Turkey initiative. In February, as you know, PKK's jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan called upon the separatist terrorist organization to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. And within this process, PKK terror group announced its decision to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. And we know that PKK terrorists this month laid down their weapons in a ceremony in northern Iraq's Süleymaniye province. And it is clearly showing that Turkish security forces have been also meticulously monitoring the latest developments about the dissolution process of the PKK terror group. On the other hand, the Turkish parliament is set to establish new mechanism to monitor the latest development about the PKK's dissolution. I think that right now many Turkish parties are supporting terror-free Turkey initiative. On the other hand, Turkish Parliament Speaker Numan Kurtulmuş and Turkish National Intelligence Chief Ibrahim Kalın have been in meeting with Turkish opposition parties. Yesterday, they met with Turkey's biggest opposition party, CHP leader Özgür Özel. CHP is also reaffirming its strong support for terror-free Turkey initiative, and it is clearly showing that right now the government is determined to realize terror-free Turkey initiative. It is projected that terror-free Turkey initiative will also help the government realize a century of Turkey vision.
Mustafa, thanks for that update. We'll continue to monitor all these headlines.
You are welcome.
Now let's take a look at this news report and we'll be right back.
The United States has pulled its negotiating team from Gaza ceasefire talks in Qatar, with U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff declaring on Thursday that Hamas had failed to engage in good faith, effectively suspending the latest round of diplomatic efforts to end the 22-month conflict. The withdrawal came shortly after Israel similarly recalled its delegation from Doha, with both nations coordinating their response to what they characterized as Hamas' unrealistic new demands. Hamas officials expressed surprise at the American accusations, issuing an early Friday statement that described their organization as having shown responsible flexibility throughout the negotiations. The group maintained it remains committed to reaching a permanent ceasefire agreement despite the current impasse. The Palestinian faction's latest proposal had included previously unreported conditions, including guarantees against Israeli military action after any 60-day truce period and the release of Hamas members involved in the attacks on Israel on October 7, 2023.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the French capital is Dr. Abdenour Toumi, who's a political analyst. Dr. Toumi, welcome to the program. I believe we have a technical difficulty. No, I can hear Dr. Toomey. Dr. Toomey, welcome to the program. I believe we're having a technical difficulty with our guest who was supposed to join us from the French capital. Mustafa, I'll turn to you. Now that the French president has decided to recognize the State of Palestine, Mustafa, what sort of a backlash could Emmanuel Macron face at this point?
Well, as you mentioned, Macron's latest decision to recognize Palestine as a state sparked U.S. and Israel backlash. We know that American and Israeli decision makers are against the unilateral actions in terms of recognizing Palestine as an independent state. I think that it will not change the attitude by France in terms of bringing long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility to the Middle East. On the other hand, we also know that Turkey has been calling upon its Western allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the region if they want to see peace and stability in the Middle East, because we know that if there is something wrong in the Middle East, it will spread to geopolitical chaos to the other parts of the world. Within this context, it will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. I think that France's decision to recognize Palestine as an independent state will be a blueprint for peace efforts and initiatives for the Middle East. I think that Palestinian people deserve to live in peace and dignity within their homeland. I think that the other Western countries will follow France's decision to recognize Palestine.
I believe Dr. Abdunnoor Toomey is back with us again. The connection has been restored. Dr. Toomey, welcome back to the program.
Greeting to you and to your distinguished guest. Thank you.
Dr. Toomey, now that France and President Macron have decided to recognize the State of Israel, I was asking Mustafa a while ago, what sort of backlash could the French president face? And we've seen it over the past few hours. The Israeli cabinet members have rejected the plan. United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also denounced France's decision, saying that it's only going to support Hamas. How are you analyzing France's decision, Dr. Toomey?
Actually, it is historic and coming from President Macron. And I think it is a clear answer to or saying no to the fait accompli and to the impunity and, in fact, to the humanitarian disaster that is taking place in Gaza Strip. And not only in Gaza Strip, but only in entire occupied Palestine. And I believe President Macron, he did reset France's Near East foreign policy, because this is France, has been calling for the two-state solution since 1967 under the lead then of General de Gaulle, and then it followed by François Mitterrand, socialist president, who made a clear speech before the Israel's MPs in the Knesset, and followed by Jacques Chirac and so on. But what happened lately is the influence and the role of the Zionist lobby in French politics, and particularly domestic politics. And this is why has made President Macron, to be indecisive and to some extent skeptical. But finally, he did understand that there is cannot continue like this. And as he stated on his tweet or on X that he calls for. There is only a political solution, and there is not a military solution for this conflict. So France now, sure, there will be other countries who will follow this. And of course, we all know it is symbolic, but we know how symbolism is important in politics, so that in geopolitics. But what is important here, it's the first. Actually, France is the first Western country state at the UN Security Council member and a G7 member. So this has a solid, I would say, argument for other countries to follow. And notably, actually, we have been hearing and reading from here and there about eventually the UK will follow and Canada. And this is important. Now, as far as Washington's, rhetoric statement goes, it is no event because we all know, since Jimmy Carter, who tried like decades ago to bring the Arabs first, and he went with the Camp David Accords, and he brought the Egyptians, and then he pushed to the, was George W. Bush, George H. Heber Bush, father, who did push strongly for the Madrid Accord that led to the Oslo, and Bill Clinton did try. But then it was only like these timid initiatives from here and there, but not with strong, I would say, pressure on the Israelis. Therefore, all this was kind of toothless. But what happened now with this administration, with the Donald Trump administration, whether the first term or his second term, now it is clear to the entire world and to the region that they are not mediators nor facilitators. They are a part of the agenda of the far right, the Zionist, particularly this government, this Talmudic Messianic government, like to push further and end for good the Palestinians. And by the way, the U.S. ambassador in Quds Sharif, he doesn't even recognize the Palestinian people. And to sum up all this, is just 2 days ago, the Knesset did vote by 71 MPs to annex, to call the government to annex what has left from the West Bank. And this is, it is very dangerous because, first of all, this means the end for good of the Oslo Accord, that has become obsolete, and also gives like an argument to the President Donald Trump administration to go on, even though it's illegal, and we all know that. But don't forget, he did call to the confirm the annexation of Golan Heights in his first term, and to remove the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Al-Quds Sharif.
Dr. Toumi, of course, these actions are symbolic. Spain and Norway also recognize the State of Palestine. But what sort of credible actions are needed at this point, not just from these countries, but also from the extended international community?
And actually, this means the international community, before its responsibility, it has to act now, and it has to say enough is enough, and to end this, as I said, to say no to the fait accompli that is imposed by the Israelis for decades, and also to push the Israelis, to, again, we speak about the PLO, the Palestinian authorities, and how corrupt it is, and there are, how those resistance movements are quote-unquote terrorists and so on. But we never question the other side. It's because actually it's very interesting. The other side doesn't want, to recognize a people called Palestine and the land called Palestine. So they are actually now, especially the decision of President Macron did unmask their rhetoric and also their lies to the entire world. And this is why now the international community, you mentioned Spain, there are also other countries like Norway, Ireland, and Belgium is on the road. So this is, President Macron's decision is paving the road for other countries, notably European countries, to step up and to not, be silenced anymore, and again say no to the impunity of the Israelis and to the fait accompli that they wanted to continue, meanwhile going for further annexation and ethnic cleansing and ending, or to some extent, making an end to the Palestinian cause.
Dr. Toomey, just before I let you go, tell me about the current state of the ceasefire talks. Now, the Israeli delegation that was in Doha has returned to Tel Aviv, but it has said that ceasefire negotiations have not been cancelled. They're ongoing, but we need to meet with other people as well back in our own countries. Now, how important are these talks at this point, Dr. Toomey, and what can we expect in the next few days as well?
It is important because, again, the resistance is still there and it's still solid. And actually, to the matter of fact, I mean, they are negotiating and they are actually, the saying who says who controls the field controls the table. I mean, now they are controlling the table because this is what is making the other side to panic and to call his negotiation team, knowing that they know everything about the details, and there is just these alibis they have been presenting to the media. And also, which is interesting here, again, speaking about the role of the U.S. or the President Donald Trump administration role, actually, they are not now a credible facilitator or mediators because they are taking side of the Israelis. So, and we see when you heard the declaration of Mr. Steve Witkoff, I mean, it has no sense because he just said, days before, that there are a progress and Hamas has been flexible and actually. And by the way, speaking about Hamas, it's not only Hamas. I mean, there are other Palestinian factions in the resistance. And also to let your distinguished viewers understand, I mean, Hamas, it's not about the Islamist movement like Hamas and the Jihad. There are other secular movements like the FPLP and the FDLP in the resistance who are also negotiating about the fate of their people that have been butchered for 22 months now.
Dr. Abdunur Toomey, thank you so much for joining us on another episode. It was a pleasure listening to your analysis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar, thank you so much for being with us in the studio.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.